Hello and welcome back to All Things Money. I'm your host, David Blain. Thank you for joining us today. During the last segment, we started talking a little bit about President Obama, his tax policy, some of the new initiatives that he announced for helping solve our crisis. We talked a little bit about what has become known as the Buffett Rule, meaning that millionaires and billionaires should not pay less tax than secretary, based on an op-ed piece that Warren Buffett wrote saying how he paid less tax than people in his office. And what we wanted to do was lay out some facts concerning this debate and to try to cut through some of the rhetoric. Yes, it's true that the bottom half of people pay no federal income tax. In fact, a lot of them get money back. Yes, it's true that the top people at the income tax bracket pay the majority of income taxes. They also make the majority of the income. Now, the purpose of this is not to say what is fair or not fair. We'll leave that up to you to judge. I certainly have my opinion that I am more for some sort of a flat type tax or consumption tax. But what I want to do and what we try to do on the show is dispel some of the rumors and the sound bites and give you some facts for you to make your decision. So we're talking a little bit about how the Republican side always talks about marginal rates. The Democrat side always talks about effective rates. Oh, and by the way, they also throw in Social Security and Medicare tax into that, and so it makes less wealthy Americans look like they pay a higher portion of tax. Once again, neither is necessarily right or wrong. They're talking about two different things. So we were talking about some of the statistics that the IRS releases. They release data on income tax returns that is a treasure trove of information if you take the time to dig into it to get some factual information. The Congressional Budget Office is supposedly a nonpartisan office that does financial projections for bills and at the request of Congress. They seem to do a pretty decent job. I mean, some of the stuff is extremely difficult to estimate. When they're talking about 10 or 20 year savings, I don't really put a lot of stock in those type of things that they do, but I do think that they try to come up with reasonable numbers, and certainly when they're making historical studies and things like that, I do think they have some credibility for what data they come up with. So we were talking about in 2008, according to the IRS, the 400 wealthiest Americans paid $19.5 billion in income tax, and their effective tax rate was 18%, down from almost 29% in 1995. And we talked about how the effective tax rate is you take the amount of tax they paid and divide it by the amount of income that they had after subtracting deductions. So, for example, if you're John Kerry and you invest in, you have millions of dollars of municipal bonds in your portfolio, your gross income may be $20, $30 million a year. I don't know, I'm just making that up. I do know that him and his wife, Teresa Hines Kerry, invest a lot in municipal bonds, so I'm using this as an example. So let's say they make $20 million in interest income from municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are free of federal tax. So their income tax return would show $20 million of gross income minus $20 million of tax-exempt income for taxable income of zero. Now, granted, he makes some other money and you factor that in there, but that's how the effective tax rate is going to be very low. The same thing with, let's say someone makes the majority of their income from capital gains. Capital gains are taxed at 15%, much lower than ordinary income of 35%. And so that's how someone conceivably with a very large income could pay a much lower tax rate. Okay, so back to the statistics. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. The most recent data, they said that top 1% with a minimum income of $332,000 paid 40% of all federal income tax collected. The average rate was 19% compared to an average of 14% for the top 1/5 of household. Now, one thing, those taxes do not take into account Social Security and Medicare. Now, this is where the Democrats, they always throw in the Social Security tax on that. Because above $106,800, there is no Social Security tax. So if you take a very high earning taxpayer that, let's say they make $5 million in salary and wages, only the first 100,000 is taxed on Social Security. So on their federal income tax, they're going to pay a high marginal rate, but not Social Security. And so when you look at the top 1% pay an effective tax rate of 1.6% on social insurance taxes, Social Security, Medicare. Some states have unemployment and some other things, versus an effective tax rate of 9% for most other income groups on wage income. Now, there's two things that you should take away with that. One is, as an individual out there, the worst type of money that you can make is wage income. That's the first clue. And we go through that with our tax planning that we do with our clients all the time. The worst money you can make is wage income. You've got to make income from the use of investments or rental property or something, passive income, as opposed to ordinary income that you get from a job. It's the worst, as we see here. And it does. The Social Security and Medicare tax as a percent on a lower number is a higher burden. When you look up at the different tax rates, though, however, if you add them up, and this is from the Congressional Budget Office, the lowest quintile, those making up to $18,900, this is including payroll and everything, pay 4.3. People making 18 to 32, 10.2. 32 to 47, 14.2, and so on, up to the top 10%, 27.5, the top 5%, 29%, and the top 1% pay an effective tax rate of 31.2% when accounting for all their income. So in summary, the anecdotes, people are talking about two different things, but on average, the effective tax rate as you go up the income scale does in fact increase. There may be isolated cases of people paying less, but on average our progressive tax system does what it's supposed to, and the more you make, the more you pay. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's show. So for All Things Money, I'm your host, David Blain. I hope you'll join us again next week at the same time and the same channels.
The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions expressed are not necessarily those of WNBU and Inner Banks Media.